Good, everyone. Welcome back to our next edition of Econ Talks. Gareth, we've had the latest inflation data for the first 3 months of 2025. Of course, really before all of this tariff stuff really got going and started to shake global markets. On the pricing front, it was always an area we were going to watch with a lot of interest. We've got headline inflation down from what was 7.3% back a couple of years. It ended 2024 at 2.2%, sort of quite comfortably within the Reserve Bank's target band, but also pretty close to that 2% midpoint. The data we've seen out this morning has increased inflation ever so slightly. It's seen that slight acceleration to 2.5%. Still within the band, absolutely, but also just pitching up a little bit from where it was before. What was sort of driving that slight, increase in inflationary heat?
Yeah, well, in terms of the tradable side or international inflation, expectations were for prices to start rebounding after we'd had some falls through 2024. And indeed, that was the case. We've seen tradable inflation push up from, I think, negative 0.8% previous quarter to an annual rate of plus 0.3%. So slightly positive, but that was certainly it was within expectations and driving that sort of pickup. On the other side of the equation, we've had non-tradable inflation, and this was where the surprise probably came through. Non-tradable inflation, I think the Reserve Bank had been picking that to ease back to 3.8%, so under 4% for the first time in a few years. We didn't quite get there, sitting at 4%, so a couple of percentage points above where the expectation had been. And so just concerns, I think, a little bit there. There's still sort of some sticky and lingering domestic price pressures through the system there and not quite moderating as much as the bank or indeed forecasters would have been anticipating. Now, some of that's due to some technical stuff, tertiary education, for example. The move from fees free being in your first year to your third year means that at the moment all students are paying for their fees, and it won't be for another couple of years until people reach that position where they didn't get the first year subsidy, and so they're eligible for that third year subsidy. So that's pushed up tradable, non-tradable inflation a little bit. But there's other aspects to it too, and probably one of the more concerning ones, of course, is energy prices, where we are seeing pressure on electricity prices from some higher wholesale prices and low lake levels last year, threatening our sort of generation capacity or limiting our generation capacity. And we know that electricity prices are going to continue rising in the CPI through into the next quarter, at least, with some fairly significant and chunky lines charges increases coming and probably other retail price increases coming through there as well. So there's enough there, I think, within that picture overall that you'd be a little bit concerned as the Reserve Bank, not on today's data in so much of itself, but just, what does it mean for where inflation is heading later this year, given that sort of background of greater inflationary pressures that we had already been anticipating prior to today's numbers coming out.
Definitely. And I think looking through some of the numbers in the wider inflation basket, I mean, there are a lot of moving parts. You noted the tertiary education change. Of course, we had a reweight of the CPI basket that came through and started to hit the numbers in this release for the first 3 months of 2025. So there are a few moving parts, but interesting that you are seeing some of those sort of more vital costs for households that are just showing a bit more pressure than we might be comfortable with. The likes of your food prices have been increasing the last couple of months, and that's fairly well understood, but it is things like dairy, it's chocolate, it's olive oil, it's coffee that have been pushing up a little bit higher. You noted some of those changes around the likes of the energy prices. The energy price increase that we've been seeing at the moment is the highest effectively since something like late 2008, if you exclude GST. You even look at things like telecommunications charges, the likes of your internet and your cell phone bill, again, increasing at their fastest rate in 25 years, sort of going back to when that series was first started in 2000. Not sort of all of them rushing up at, absolute leaps and bounds, but just uncomfortable enough if you're a household. You keep getting these little notifications saying, hey, your price is going to go up, your price is going to go up, your price is going to go up. I feel like a lot of households are going, I thought we did this. I thought we'd sort of gone through those inflationary pressures. And the reason that's important, right, is looking to the year ahead. We've got these tariffs in place. We're a little bit worried about global pricing pressures already. And if we're starting now in New Zealand from a point where our inflationary pressures are a touch higher than we thought they would be, just that starting point doesn't give you quite as much buffer room into the future. Now, Does that mean that the Reserve Bank needs to start hiking interest rates? Absolutely not. We're not anywhere near that at the moment. Inflation's still within the target range. But I think it means that you can't say yet that having the OCR pushed below 3% is a certainty. I think there's still this real sort of you need to watch and wait how the data evolves. For the Reserve Bank, they've noted already that they think there's a bit of caution on the downside in terms of look, if you do see some of those pricing pressures that start to fall away because there's not as much economic growth going on, they might have to cut interest rates. Totally appropriate. But they do have to be a bit data dependent here, in my view, because if there are those further pricing pressures that come through, even though the economy might be weaker than originally thought, they've really got to be worried a little bit about those sort of ongoing pricing pressures. Now, I mean, one of the big things here that the Reserve Bank thinks about is also inflation expectations. At the moment, they seem not too bad, pretty well grounded. Do you expect that to continue?
What we've typically seen with inflation expectations is that they are very much driven by what inflation is here and now. It's particularly true for your sort of 1 year ahead expectations, but also to a lesser extent the 2 year ahead. It doesn't really anticipate inflation a great deal. It's kind of like when people get asked the question, they go, "Oh, look out the window. What's the number? Oh, well, that's what it is now. That's what it'll be in the future as well." So inflation expectations, like you say, sitting around 2% or slightly above. That's a little bit higher than they were on average, I think, through the decade prior to COVID. So already not quite as low as they have been previously. But the risk for the Reserve Bank now with inflation back up at 2.5% is that as those questions get asked of households and businesses over the next few weeks and months, the response will be, oh, inflation is possibly going to be a bit higher than we were previously thinking. Certainly, that's the evidence we're seeing on the here and now for inflation. So that's how people may well respond to those questions. That will be, if that does come through with the numbers, that will be something that concerns the Reserve Bank because they have talked quite repeatedly over the last year or so about inflation expectations and the importance of them being well anchored near the midpoint of the target band. The importance as well of inflation being near the midpoint of the target band so that they can respond appropriately with monetary policy as they need to, either up or down in terms of interest rates, depending on how the data comes out. So, yeah, key elements to watch there. And look, I fully agree with what you're saying. The Reserve Bank will continue to cut the official cash rate over the next 3 months. 25 basis points a time gets us down to 3% by July. And at that stage, of course, we're due for another CPI release. What will the data show us then? The risks are that it continues to push higher. And I think 2.5%, some people have described that as still comfortably within the Reserve Bank's target band. I'm not quite so sure about that. And certainly if it's pushing up maybe towards 2.6 or 2.7, we've got 2.8 later this year penciled into our forecasts. That's the sort of level which historically the Reserve Bank would actually be quite uncomfortable about. There's a risk there that it does pop outside the target band and they do start to need to jump up and down on it. The reality is, when you look back over the last 3 years, 2.8% doesn't look like that higher inflation when we had 7% plus. And the graphs sort of bear that out when you try and put them up and say, oh, look, inflation, it's picking up. And people go, where? I can't really see it there on that graph. But the reality is there is a bit more coming through. So, yeah, 3% OCR early in the second half of this year. Further cuts beyond that. Well, remember, the Reserve Bank's core mandate and their single target is keeping inflation under control. Now, if weak economic growth tells you in a year's time that inflation and pricing pressures are going to be weak, responding to that is appropriate. But at the moment, that sort of logic or that process of logic from lower growth to lower inflation, it's not entirely guaranteed given the shocks that are flowing through the global economy and ultimately washing up on our shores here in New Zealand as well.
Exactly. I mean, you look at the fact that we had a pretty challenging recession last year. Prices still went up and are now accelerating off the back of that. It does. I think the big thing here, and not wanting to try and overreact and respond, but when we do see some of those other comments coming out, people saying they're comfortable where we currently are, I feel like that's perhaps where we got ourselves in trouble last time. We were comfortable until we weren't. We didn't pick up the signs early enough. I'd much rather, after that experience, err a little bit more on the side of caution and say, look, don't have to make a definitive call either way, but it's also not the appropriate time to paint yourself in a corner when there are more ambiguous outcomes to come. So again, it'll have to be data dependent, it'll have to be forward looking, and I think there's a lot of water still to go under the bridge. We'll see how all of that evolves, both the global economic environment, what happens with prices, and how the Reserve Bank responds and reacts on one of our future editions of Econ Talks.